The most dangerous military working dog alive hadn't obeyed a single command in 3 years, until a nurse in blue scrubs walked into his enclosure, crouched down, and whispered one word nobody else on the base had ever heard. Koda, a Belgian Malinois who had hospitalized 2 elite handlers and destroyed 4 years of training programs, went completely still. His growl died in his throat. His body lowered slowly to the concrete floor. The entire Iron Ridge Defense Medical Center watched through bulletproof glass, and not one person in that hallway could explain what they had just witnessed, because not one of them had bothered to learn who she really was. Before the story goes any further, if you're watching right now, hit that subscribe button and stay with me until the very end, because what happens next is something you won't see coming. Drop a like and leave a comment telling me what city or country you're watching from. I want to see exactly how far this story has traveled. Now let's get into it. The morning Elena Voss arrived at Iron Ridge Defense Medical Center, the temperature outside was 31 degrees and dropping, and nobody at the front gate was expecting her. That was the first problem. The second problem was the way she looked. A woman in her mid-40s, medium height, no visible rank insignia, carrying a worn canvas bag over one shoulder and a folded paper intake form she'd printed herself because the base's digital system had rejected her credentials twice during processing. Her hair was pulled back in a way that suggested function rather than care. She wore no jewelry except for a plain watch on her left wrist, the face scratched enough to suggest it had been through things. Her shoes were practical. Her coat was civilian. Corporal Renata Weiss, the gate officer that morning, looked at Elena the way people look at packages left at the wrong address. Not hostile exactly, but confused about what to do next. "You're the consultant?" Weiss asked. "That's what the paperwork says," Elena replied. Weiss looked at the form, then at Elena, then at the form again. "For the K-9 program?" "For the K-9 rehabilitation evaluation, yes." Weiss picked up her phone, had a short conversation with someone on the other end, and then waved Elena through with the kind of half-interested gesture that made it clear she expected this particular visitor to be back at the gate within the hour, heading home. Elena walked through without hurrying. Iron Ridge was not a small installation. It sat on 1,200 acres of federally controlled land in a part of the state where the nearest town had one gas station and a diner that closed at 7. The base had been operational for over 4 decades, and in that time it had developed the particular personality of all long-established military facilities, structured to the point of rigidity, hierarchical in ways that went beyond rank, and deeply suspicious of anything that arrived without a pedigree it already recognized. The Defense Medical Center occupied the northeast corner of the installation, a cluster of connected buildings that served both as a treatment facility for active duty personnel and as a research hub for military medicine and animal-assisted intervention programs. The K-9 division operated out of a separate compound on the facility's edge, a series of kennels, training fields, and evaluation spaces surrounded by reinforced chain link and signage that left no room for ambiguity about what happened to people who entered without authorization. Elena had authorization. She also had a map that was 6 months out of date, which meant she spent 11 minutes walking in the wrong direction before a passing staff sergeant named Dillard pointed her toward the correct building without being asked. She thanked him. He nodded and kept walking. It was that kind of place. The K-9 administrative office was staffed by a young specialist named Tomlin, who offered Elena coffee before she'd finished introducing herself, which she appreciated. While she filled out the secondary intake forms, there were always secondary intake forms, Tomlin explained, in the careful way of someone delivering information they'd been told to deliver carefully, that the evaluation had been arranged at the request of Base Commander Margolis, that several of the K-9 team's senior personnel had not been consulted before the request was made, and that there was therefore a degree of, he paused, tension surrounding her arrival. "How much tension?" Elena asked, signing the third page without looking up. "Sergeant Ward already filed 2 objection memos," Tomlin said. Elena put down her pen. "Before I've even seen the dog?" Tomlin's expression confirmed it. She picked the pen back up. "Okay." She met Sergeant Caleb Ward 20 minutes later in a briefing room that smelled like burned coffee and dry erase markers. Ward was 43, built like someone who had never stopped competing with a 25-year-old version of himself. And he had the specific brand of controlled impatience that certain kinds of authority figures develop when they've spent too long being the loudest person in any room they enter. I was flanked by two junior handlers, Morrison and Tate, who arranged themselves slightly behind him in a way that was entirely intentional. Ward did not offer his hand. "You're the nurse," he said. "Rehabilitation consultant," Elena replied. "With a nursing background, yes." Nursing background. He said it the way someone might repeat a phrase in a foreign language they don't speak. "And Base Commander Margolis thinks that qualifies you to evaluate an operational K-9 asset." Commander Margolis reviewed my assessment file and made the determination. "I'm not here to debate his judgment." "I am," Ward said flatly, "because I'm the one who has to manage this program, and I'm the one who has to deal with the consequences when a civilian walks into a kennel environment she doesn't understand and either gets hurt or sets back 18 months of work." Elena looked at him steadily. "What work?" Ward's jaw tightened. "Excuse me?" "You said 18 months of work. I'd like to understand what that work has produced. What's Koda's current evaluation status? What are the metrics? What behavioral protocols have been attempted, and what outcomes did you document?" There was a short silence. Morrison shifted his weight slightly. Tate looked at the wall. "The animal is in an acute behavioral distress state," Ward said. "He's been classified as non-deployable. We're managing the situation." "For how long?" "That's an internal program matter." "I was sent to evaluate the animal," Elena said. "His history is relevant to that evaluation. I'm not asking for classified deployment records. I'm asking for behavioral logs." Ward stared at her for a moment, then turned slightly toward Morrison. Some kind of communication passed between them that Elena catalogued without comment. "I'll have Tomlin pull what's available," Ward said. "Thank you," Elena said, and she meant it without warmth or sarcasm, which seemed to bother Ward more than either of those things would have. The behavioral logs, when she got them, were incomplete in ways that told a story of their own. There were gaps of weeks at a time, incidents recorded with vague language that obscured more than it revealed, and evaluation scores that dropped sharply in the months following a redacted entry from approximately 3 years prior. Elena sat with the files for 2 hours in a small room Tomlin had cleared for her, taking notes by hand in a narrow notebook she'd brought from home. She did not use the base's computer system for her notes. When Tomlin asked if she needed anything, she asked for a facility map, a current one, and a schedule of when the kennel area had its lowest traffic. "Early morning," Tomlin said, "before 6. Ward runs drills at 7, but before that it's just the overnight handler and the feed staff." "Thank you," Elena said. She was at the kennel compound at 5:47 the next morning. The overnight handler was a young specialist named Price, who looked startled to see her but checked her credentials without argument and walked her through the outer corridor without being asked. The facility was quieter at this hour, the sounds of dogs in adjacent kennels reduced to occasional movement, the controlled climate doing its work without much drama. Price stopped outside the last door in the corridor, a reinforced entrance with an additional security panel and a warning sign that was more emphatic than the others. "He's in the interior enclosure," Price said. "He can see into the outer space, but he's not going to approach the gate unless he decides to." "Has he attacked the barrier?" "Twice last month. Both times after Ward ran a simulated scenario in the adjacent field." Price paused. "I probably shouldn't have said that." "It's in the behavioral log," Elena said. It wasn't exactly, but it was inferable, and she watched Price's expression confirm the inference. She stood at the exterior gate for a while and looked through. The space was designed for a large working dog, adequate, functional, nothing more. There were enrichment objects that had been added at some point and then apparently abandoned. A tug toy sat in the corner, still in its packaging. Elena looked at that for a moment. Then Koda appeared from the interior space, and the quality of silence in the corridor changed. He was larger than she'd expected from the file photographs. Or perhaps he was exactly the size described and the photographs simply hadn't captured something about him. Belgian Malinois were not massive dogs in the way of some working breeds, but Koda moved with a density that wasn't about weight. It was about precision. Every movement registered. He crossed from the interior to the outer enclosure space and stopped. And he looked at Elena the way he presumably looked at everything that entered his field of awareness, with complete assessment and zero interest in performing calm. Elena looked back. She didn't speak. She didn't move toward the gate. She stood with her weight slightly forward, her hands at her sides, and she stayed there for 4 minutes without doing anything else. Koda stayed where he was. His ears tracked. His tail didn't move. At some point, his posture shifted, not toward aggression and not toward relaxation, toward something more like attention. Price, standing a careful distance back, was very quiet. Elena finally said something. It was quiet enough that Price couldn't catch the full sound of it. A short phrase, or possibly a single word, delivered in a register that was measured rather than commanding. She said it once and then was still again. Koda's ears came forward. He didn't move toward the gate, but the shape of him changed in a way that Price, who had been working with military dogs for 3 years, recognized immediately and couldn't quite explain. The animal had shifted from assessment into something else. "What did you say to him?" Price asked. "Nothing important," Elena said. "Can you tell me if he eats consistently?" Price blinked. Yes. Morning feeding, mostly. He's erratic about the afternoon portion." "Is there a pattern to when he refuses it?" "After the days when Ward runs the compound scenarios." Elena made a note. "Okay. Thank you." She left before Ward's team arrived for the 7 o'clock drills. She had what she needed for the morning. What she hadn't expected was that Price would mention the early visit to Morrison over breakfast, and that Morrison would mention it to Ward by 7:30, and that Ward would be waiting in the administrative corridor when Elena came through the main entrance at 9. "You went to the kennel at 0600, Ward said. It wasn't a question. "I had authorization from Commander Margolis's office for full facility access during daylight hours," Elena said. "I went during a low-traffic period specifically to avoid disrupting your team's schedule. That animal is dangerous." "I was outside the barrier. I don't care where you were. That compound is under my operational authority, and I expect to be notified before anyone runs independent assessments in my area." Elena stopped walking. She turned toward him and gave him the full weight of her attention, which was, Ward would realize only later, a different thing than the polite attention she'd offered in the briefing room. "Sergeant Ward," she said, "I was brought here by Commander Margolis to conduct an independent evaluation. The word independent is doing significant work in that assignment. I understand that's uncomfortable. I'm not trying to make it comfortable. But I'm going to do the job I was sent here to do, and I'd prefer to do it without spending energy on permission conflicts that your commander has already resolved." Ward stared at her. "You don't know what you're doing with that animal." "Maybe," Elena said. "I've been wrong before." She walked past him. That afternoon, Ward called a team briefing that Elena was not invited to. She knew about it because Tomlin mentioned it in passing while handing her a second set of facility maps, and because the administrative assistant's expression carried the particular discomfort of someone who knows more than they're supposed to say. Elena thanked him for the maps and went back to her notes. The following morning, she was at the compound again at 5:50. Price was there, and this time he'd clearly been expecting her because he had the exterior gate already unlocked and a second folding chair set up near the back wall. "You didn't have to do that," Elena said. "I know," Price said. He shrugged. "He slept near the gate last night. He doesn't usually do that." Elena sat down in the chair closest to the gate. Koda appeared from the interior space within 3 minutes. He stood at the same distance as the day before and looked at her with the same calibrated attention. Elena took out her notebook and wrote in it without looking up, and the normalization of her presence in his space was a deliberate choice rather than casual comfort. After 15 minutes, she spoke to him again. The same short phrase, the same measured register. And this time, Koda moved, not toward her, but to one side, the kind of lateral shift that created a slightly different angle on the same focal point. His body language had no performance in it. He was simply repositioning. Price watched from the back of this corridor. "He hasn't moved voluntarily in proximity to a person in 6 months, he said, quietly enough that he might have been saying it to himself. Elena didn't look up from her notebook. "What happened 6 months ago?" Price was quiet for a moment. "Ward tried a new protocol. Didn't work." "What kind of protocol?" Another pause. "Aversive conditioning. He wanted to reset Koda's response patterns." Elena's pen stopped moving. She didn't say anything for a few seconds. Then she wrote something, capped her pen, and looked through the gate at Koda. The dog was still watching her. "Okay," Elena said. She completed her preliminary assessment report on the 4th day and submitted it to Commander Margolis's office through the base's secure document system. The executive summary was 4 pages. The recommendation section was longer. She had been methodical, specific, and had drawn on behavioral records that the program hadn't cross-referenced in the way she had, which produced observations that the internal team either hadn't made or hadn't documented. Ward was called into Commander Margolis's office that afternoon. Elena was not told what was discussed, but Ward emerged from that meeting with the careful expression of a man managing something he didn't want visible on his face. He found Elena in the small room she'd been using and stood in the doorway. "The commander wants a live demonstration," he said. "Of what?" "Your approach. Hands-on, in the compound. He wants to see Koda's response to your methods in a controlled environment." Ward's tone was flat in the way of someone working to keep it flat. "I'll be running the parameters." Elena looked up from her work. "You want to run the parameters of my evaluation. I want to make sure it's conducted safely, with appropriate safety protocols in place." "That's not the same thing." "It is in my compound." She looked at him for a long moment. Ward held her gaze with the practiced steadiness of someone who had won a lot of staring contests. "When?" Elena asked. "Day after tomorrow, 0900. "I'll be there," she said. What Elena didn't know, what she couldn't have known, because it was arranged in a conversation she wasn't part of, was that Ward had spent the evening between her assessment submission and the morning of the demonstration calling in every professional obligation available to him. He reached out to 2 senior handlers from a sister installation, a K-9 program director he'd worked with for a decade, and 3 officers who owed him favors. By the time the demonstration was scheduled, the viewing area adjacent to the main training compound had been arranged with chairs and a senior staff presence that made it look less like a professional evaluation and more like an audience assembled to watch something fail. Elena arrived at 9:05 to find 17 people in the observation area. She didn't break stride. Ward met her at the compound entrance and was in full operational gear, which was a choice that read clearly. Morrison and Tate were flanking him again, and there were 2 additional handlers she didn't recognize, both larger men who positioned themselves with the physical confidence of people who had been told they wouldn't be needed, but wanted to make sure everyone knew they were available. "We'll run a standard compound scenario," Ward said. "Koda will be released into the field. Your objective is to demonstrate the behavioral response you described in your assessment. I'll run the parameters." "What scenario?" Elena asked. "Active threat simulation, standard protocol." Elena looked at the compound field, then at the viewing area. "Who's the decoy?" "Reyes." Ward gestured toward one of the unfamiliar handlers. "He's done 100 of these." Elena looked at Reyes, who nodded at her with the specific kind of confidence that communicated he expected to have an easy morning. "And Koda's baseline today?" Elena asked. "Has he been fed? What's his arousal state?" "He's operational," Ward said. It was not an answer to the question she had asked. Elena looked at Ward for a moment. Then she took off her jacket, folded it, and handed it to Tomlin, who had appeared beside her at some point, and received the jacket with the expression of someone who wasn't sure how they'd become part of this situation. "Okay," Elena said. "Let's do it." The field was 40 meters by 60, surrounded by the compound's interior fencing. Koda was brought out from the kennel corridor by 2 handlers who were moving with the deliberate carefulness of people managing something they were genuinely afraid of. The dog's energy was different from the early morning sessions. The presence of multiple people in operational gear, the changed energy of the space, the absence of the low-traffic quiet that Elena had been working within. His movement through the corridor was controlled but hot, the way a high-pressure system feels before a storm. Elena stood in the center of the field. In the observation area, someone coughed. Ward stood at the field's edge with his arms crossed. Reyes, the decoy, positioned himself 30 meters from Elena with a padded training sleeve on his left arm. Koda was released. He moved immediately and fast, not toward Elena, not toward Reyes, but in a sweeping assessment pattern that covered the field's perimeter in a way that was about threat mapping rather than attack. Elena tracked him without turning, keeping her peripheral awareness active while her body stayed still. She understood what the observation area could not see from its angle. Koda was overwhelmed. The scenario had been designed or had fallen accidentally into being designed in a way that reproduced the conditions of a bad prior experience. Too many people, too much gear, too much performance of authority in a space that the dog associated with something painful. She kept her weight even and her breathing steady, and she waited. Ward, from the edge of the field, made a hand signal toward Reyes. Reyes moved. He moved toward Elena rather than away from her, which was not the standard protocol for a passive decoy position. It was a deviation that Elena registered in the half-second before Koda registered it, and she watched the dog's assessment pattern shift instantly, from perimeter mapping to targeted response. The threshold between controlled and activated in a trained military working dog is narrow, and Ward's operation of this scenario had just put extreme pressure on it. Koda launched. He was fast in the way that made the observation area go completely silent. Not a gradual acceleration, but an immediate shift from stillness into full force. 45 pounds of muscle and training crossing the field in a line that was aimed at Reyes with the specific precision that years of operational work had built into the animal's body. Reyes backpedaled and raised his sleeved arm, and in doing so moved it across a line that would bring the strike into contact with the wrong angle, the kind of contact that the sleeve didn't protect well, the kind that had sent handlers to the infirmary before. Someone in the observation area said something sharp. Ward started forward. Elena took 3 steps toward the center of the field's trajectory, into Koda's line, and said one thing. It was not loud. It was not a sharp command voice that military dog handlers used, the kind designed to cut through environmental noise and activate a conditioned response. It was something else entirely, a specific combination of 2 syllables in a particular order that had been established a long time ago in a different kind of field, under circumstances that had nothing to do with a demonstration designed to humiliate a nurse in front of an assembled audience. Koda stopped. He was 4 feet from Reyes. Every muscle in his body had been committed to that run. Stopping at that point from that speed with that level of activation, it shouldn't have worked. Even the best trained animals, at that threshold, didn't stop cleanly on verbal command alone. It was against the physics of what the body was already doing. Koda stopped, and he turned, and he looked at Elena. And the quality of his attention, the particular way he oriented to her, the shift in his posture from acute activation to something that was not relaxation but was, unmistakably, recognition, made Specialist Price, standing in the observation area with his arms pressed against the railing, feel something in his chest he couldn't immediately name. Ward stood at the field's edge with his hand still raised and his mouth slightly open. The observation area was completely silent. Elena walked forward slowly. She closed the distance between herself and Koda in measured steps, keeping her hands visible, and when she reached him, she crouched down to his level, and he put his head toward her the way that dogs who trust someone do. Not fully, not without reservation, but with the specific gesture of an animal who has decided, based on information nobody else in that compound possessed, that the person in front of him was known. From the observation area, nobody moved. Then the door to the compound opened from the administrative side, and Commander Derek Margolis walked through it with a folder under his arm, and 2 officers she didn't recognize behind him. He looked at the field, at Elena crouched in the center of it, at Koda with his head lowered beside her, at Ward standing frozen at the edge, and his expression was the expression of a man who had suspected something and was now watching it confirmed in a way that was going to require him to make several difficult decisions before the end of the day. "Sergeant Ward," he said, and his voice carried across the field without effort. "My office. Now." Ward looked at him, looked at Elena, looked at Koda. He walked toward the administrative entrance without saying anything, and both of the junior handlers he'd positioned flanking him fell in behind him, and Reyes pulled the training sleeve off his arm and held it at his side and looked at the field with an expression that had nothing professional in it. Elena stayed where she was. Koda stayed beside her. Commander Margolis walked to the field's edge and looked down at both of them. And when Elena finally looked up at him, he held her gaze for a moment before he opened the folder. "Ms. Voss," he said, "I think it's time we talked about your full file." Commander Derek Margolis did not open the folder right away. He stood at the edge of the compound field, with the late morning light coming in flat and cold from the east, and he looked at Elena Voss for a moment in the way that senior officers sometimes look at situations they've been managing at a distance, with the particular calculation of someone who is measuring the distance between what they expected and what is actually in front of them. Elena rose from her crouch slowly. Koda remained at her left side, not pressed against her, not leaning, simply present, the way that working dogs position themselves around people they had decided were relevant, She kept her hand where the dog could see it and waited for Margolis to speak. "Inside," he said. "Not the briefing room, my office." She nodded. He turned and walked back toward the administrative building without looking to see if she was following, which told her something about his read of the situation. She fell in behind him. Koda made a sound, not a bark, something lower, the kind of sound that wasn't directed at a threat, and she glanced back once before the compound door closed. The observation area had not emptied. Several of the people Ward had assembled were still standing at the railing, and their silence as Elena passed had a different quality than the silence during the field incident. The hostility that had been present when she arrived that morning had been replaced by something less defined and, in some ways, harder to manage. She'd seen that expression on people before. It was the expression of individuals who have just been wrong in public and haven't yet decided what to do about it. Margolis's office was on the second floor of the administrative wing, a room that had the functional austerity of spaces designed to project authority without spending money on it. He sat behind his desk and put the folder in front of him, but still didn't open it. He gestured toward the chair across from him. Elena sat. "How long," Margolis said, "were you planning to let this go without telling anyone?" "I wasn't sure it was relevant until I saw his response this morning," Elena said. "And I wasn't completely certain it would hold." It held. It held, she agreed. Margolis opened the folder. It contained a single sheet of paper at the top, and she could see from the classification marking at its header that it had come from a level of the system she hadn't been expecting him to have direct access to. He didn't show it to her. He read from it without inflection, the way people read things they've already absorbed. Elena Voss, currently contracted as a civilian rehabilitation consultant through the Defense Medical Behavioral Program's office. He paused. Previously. Another pause. Formerly designated as a combat trauma specialist, Special Operations K9 Integration Unit, attached to Task Force Harlow, rank of E7 at separation, medical discharge. He looked up. That's where the public record ends. Elena said nothing. Task Force Harlow's operational logs are not something I have access to, Margolis said. But I know enough about that unit to understand why your file was sealed. Then you understand why I didn't lead with it. I understand why you thought you didn't have to. He set the paper down. I'm going to ask you a direct question, and I want a direct answer. Koda was attached to a K9 integration unit in the 2 years before he was transferred to this installation. Were you his original handler? The answer was a second longer than it should have been, which was its own answer. We worked together, Elena said. The designation handler is more formal than the actual relationship was. But he knew your command. A command I established during integration training, before the mission. Margolis was quiet. He looked at the folder. He looked at Elena. Outside his window, the wind had picked up and was moving through the trees at the compound's edge in long, slow waves. 3 years ago, he said, Koda was transferred here after what was reported in his file as a traumatic field incident. His handler was... He stopped. Killed, Elena said. His handler was killed. You weren't... No, I had already separated by then. The unit continued the program with a different structure. She kept her voice level, which required something. Koda was with a handler named Marcus Reel. Reel was very good. The dog trusted him completely. She stopped. When Reel died, Koda lost the second person in his operational experience who had used a specific language system with him, the system I developed. Margolis understood something then, and it showed in the quality of his silence. Not shock exactly, but the shift of a person who has just felt the actual weight of something they'd been holding abstractly. He's not dangerous, Elena said. He's been responding to an environment that makes no sense to him. Nobody here speaks his language. Ward's conditioning protocols reinforce the confusion instead of addressing it, and the aversive methods he ran 6 months ago. She stopped herself. The behavioral logs tell the rest of that. Ward's methods are going to be a significant part of the conversation I'm about to have, Margolis said. He picked up a pen and turned it in his fingers. The assessment you submitted flagged 4 documented incidents that weren't in his reports. 5, Elena said. The 5th one's in the maintenance log, not the behavioral records. Someone filed it under facility repair. Margolis looked at her steadily. You found that. I had time. He set the pen down. I'm going to need you to stay on installation for the next several days. I want a full behavioral rehabilitation proposal on my desk by Friday, and I want you available when I talk to the K9 Program Oversight Board. That conversation is going to happen sooner than anyone planned." He stood, which closed the meeting. "One more question. The command you used this morning, the one that stopped him." "Yes." "Can anyone else learn it?" Elena thought about this, not because the answer was complicated, but because the answer had a shape to it that she wanted to give honestly. "They can learn the sound," she said. "Whether he'd respond to someone else saying it, that's a different question. What he responded to this morning wasn't just the word." Margolis nodded slowly. "Get me that proposal by Friday." She left his office and walked back down the corridor and did not allow herself to think about Marcus Reel until she had pushed through the exterior door into the open air where the wind was cold and smelled like cut grass and diesel, the specific combination of a military installation on a working day, and then she stood outside and breathed it in for a moment before she kept moving. She had work to do, Sad. The next 36 hours operated on 2 tracks that ran parallel and occasionally collided. On the first track, Elena worked. She was given a proper workspace in the behavioral research wing, a real office this time, not the cleared-out storage room, with a functioning computer terminal and access to the behavioral program's full archival records, which turned out to contain significantly more than the edited files she'd been given initially. She spent the first day and a half building a rehabilitation framework that was specific to Koda's documented history, his neurological stress responses, the particular way that his training had been layered on top of a foundation she had helped build years earlier. She ate at her desk. She slept 4 hours in the consultant quarters and was back at her desk by 2 in the morning because her mind wouldn't quiet and there was no point pretending otherwise. On the second track, Iron Ridge was shifting in ways she could feel without fully seeing. She understood installations. She'd spent enough of her adult life inside them to know how information moved. Not through official channels, not primarily, but through the informal networks that developed whenever you put large numbers of people in close quarters with a common purpose and a clear hierarchy. Word of what had happened in the compound had moved through Iron Ridge in the hours after the demonstration with a speed that formal reporting never matched. By evening of the first day, she was aware of being looked at differently in corridors. Not warmly, not always, but with a recalibrated attention that had replaced the earlier dismissal. What she couldn't see, because it was happening in rooms she wasn't in, was the conversation about Ward. She got a partial view of it through Tomlin, who was constitutionally incapable of being entirely opaque, and who mentioned while delivering updated files that Ward had been in a 3-hour meeting with Margolis and the base's legal office the afternoon after the demonstration. He also mentioned, with the careful expression of someone choosing their words, that Morrison had requested a transfer to a different division that same morning. "What about Tate?" Elena asked. Tomlin looked at his clipboard. "Still in the K9 division." "Is he the one who filed the maintenance report on the 6th-month incident?" Tomlin's expression answered before he did. "I can't confirm internal reports." "That's fine," Elena said. "Thank you for the files." She was back at the kennel compound by 6 the following morning, this time with Margolis's authorization on record and a rehabilitation session officially logged. Price was there, and he had brought her coffee without being asked, which she appreciated in the specific way of someone who hadn't been getting enough sleep. Koda was at the interior gate when she arrived, not pacing, not in the threat posture that Price said he defaulted to most mornings. He was simply at the gate, and when Elena came through the outer door, his ears came forward, and he made the low sound again, the one that wasn't a growl. "He was there when I got in at 5, Price said. "Just sitting." Elena crouched at the exterior gate and took out her notebook. "Has he eaten today?" "Full morning portion. First time in 2 weeks he's finished it." She made a note. "Okay, let's open the outer gate." Price looked at her. "Ms. Voss, I know," she said. "I have authorization, and I'm asking you to be here and to document what you observe. If anything in his body language suggests we shouldn't proceed, we don't proceed." Price held her gaze for a moment, then moved to the gate control. The outer gate opened. Koda didn't move immediately, which was itself significant. A dog operating on reactive stress would have surged. He watched Elena with the measured attention she'd come to recognize in him. The assessment that had nothing aggressive in it, just the information gathering of an animal deciding whether something was real. She moved into the outer enclosure space slowly, giving him her full peripheral attention while keeping her direct gaze off his. Not avoidance, just the specific body language that prevented a challenge read. She sat on the floor 4 feet from him with her notebook on her knee and waited. He came to her in his own time. It took 11 minutes, and the final approach was tentative in a way that she suspected nobody at Iron Ridge had ever seen from him. A large military working dog moving with the careful uncertainty of an animal, relearning something it had stopped trusting. When he finally closed the last foot of distance and pushed his head briefly against her shoulder, Price made a sound that was not professional and couldn't be helped. Elena put one hand on the dog's side. She could feel the muscle tension in him, the history of the past 3 years, and the particular way his body still held itself even in a moment of concession. He was not fixed. He was not magically restored. He was a damaged working animal who had found one point of reference in a landscape that had stopped making sense. And he was holding on to it with the uncomplicated directness of a creature who didn't have the option of pretending things were fine when they weren't. She stayed with him for 40 minutes. She was back in her office by 7:30 when her phone, her personal phone, not the base system, rang with a number she didn't recognize. She looked at it for a moment. Then she answered. The voice on the other end was male, measured, with the particular flatness of someone choosing their register carefully. Ms. Voss, my name is Carver. I'm calling from the Department of Defense Office of Program Review. We've been made aware of the situation at Iron Ridge and we're conducting a preliminary inquiry. A pause. I'd like to arrange a call with you at your earliest convenience. Elena's hand was still. What kind of inquiry? She asked. Operational Program Standards, the K-9 Division's documentation history. Another pause, shorter this time. And the circumstances of your engagement with this installation. I was contracted through the Defense Medical Behavioral Programs Office, she said. My engagement is straightforward. Your engagement may be, Carver said. Your history with the program in question is somewhat less so. The way he said it, not accusatory, but precise, told her that the call was not primarily about Ward, or about documentation failures, or about the rehabilitation proposal she was preparing for Margolis. It was about her. I'll need to have any formal inquiry go through Commander Margolis's office, she said. If you want to schedule something, that's the appropriate channel. Of course, Carver said. I'll reach out to the commander's office this afternoon. The call ended. Elena set her phone on the desk and looked at the wall for a moment. Then she picked up the base handset and called Tomlin and asked him to let Commander Margolis know that someone named Carver from Program Review would be contacting his office. Tomlin said he'd pass it on. There was a brief pause before he asked if everything was all right, in the tone of someone who already suspected the answer. Yes, Elena said, because it was the right thing to say and not entirely untrue. She went back to the rehabilitation proposal. The call from Carver's office reached Margolis at 2 in the afternoon, and by 3:15 Elena was back in his office, this time without the folder on his desk, and with a different quality of attention in the room. Margolis had a second officer with him, a woman named Colonel Petra Brandt, who was introduced as the base's legal counsel and who had the specific posture of someone who spent her professional life in rooms where things were about to get complicated. Program Review is citing Task Force Harlow's operational records as relevant to their inquiry, Margolis said, which is significant because those records are sealed at a level that Program Review doesn't normally have authority to access. Unless someone has provided them access, Brandt said. She looked at Elena with professional neutrality. Ms. Voss, I want to be transparent with you about what we're looking at. Program Review has flagged your engagement with this installation on the basis that your prior operational history creates a conflict of interest in evaluating the K-9 program. That's the formal basis. That's not the actual basis, Elena said. Brandt's expression didn't change. No. The actual concern appears to be that your assessment report has implicated the K-9 Division's management in documentation irregularities significant enough to trigger an Inspector General referral, and someone with standing to do so has initiated a counter-inquiry designed to introduce questions about your credibility before that referral is processed. Elena sat with this. She had been wrong about the timeline, not about what was happening, but about how fast it was moving. Ward, she said. We can't confirm that at this stage, Brandt said. No, Elena said, but the timing is what it is. Margolis leaned forward slightly. Here's what I need to know. Is there anything in your Task Force Harlow service that would give a program review inquiry legitimate grounds to challenge your standing as a professional evaluator? It was the right question, and he'd asked it directly, which she respected. My medical discharge was the result of a field injury, she said. The specifics are classified, but the discharge itself was fully documented and honorable. There's nothing in my service record that constitutes misconduct or professional failure. She paused. There are elements of the Task Force Harlow mission logs that, if surfaced without context, could be framed in ways that create misleading impressions. Such as? The command system I used with Koda, the protocol I developed for the K9 integration program. It was field-tested under operational conditions that weren't standard. Some of the methods I used weren't in the official training manual because I wrote them after the manual was published. She kept her voice steady. If someone wants to argue that my methods were unauthorized, they can find the language to do it. Brandt made a note. That would be a stretch. Stretching is what counter-inquiries do, Elena said. Margolis was quiet for a moment. Then he said, The IG referral goes forward regardless. My hands are already off that particular wheel. He looked at her. But I want you to understand that this installation's support for your rehabilitation proposal and your professional standing here is not contingent on what program review decides to investigate. You came here, you did the work, and what happened in that compound speaks for itself. Elena appreciated this more than she showed. Thank you. Don't thank me yet, Margolis said, with the dry flatness of someone who had been in enough of these situations to know how they tended to develop. Carver's office wants a formal meeting on site, day after tomorrow, and they're bringing someone with them. Who? Margolis glanced at Brandt, and the glance contained something, not uncertainty, but a kind of deliberate carefulness, the way you look at someone before delivering information you know is going to land with weight. Colonel Harriet Voss, Brandt said. She was the commanding officer of Task Force Harlow. Elena's face didn't move, but her hand on the desk went very still, and Price, who wasn't in the room and couldn't see it, would never know that the woman who had sat calmly on the floor of a kennel enclosure with the base's most dangerous animal was, for exactly 3 seconds, not calm at all. Colonel Harriet Voss, whose operational decisions had determined the shape of Elena's last 6 months with Task Force Harlow, whose sign-off had been on the mission brief that sent Marcus Reel into the field where he died, whose signature was on Elena's medical discharge paperwork, filed 2 weeks after that mission, with a commendation that was generous in its language and careful in its omissions. Colonel Harriet Voss, who was not a natural ally of anyone whose IG referral threatened to open a review of program management decisions made 3 years ago under her command. Elena looked at Margolis. Day after tomorrow, she said. 0900, he confirmed. She stood. She had a proposal to finish and 36 hours to decide how much of herself she was willing to put on the table in a room with the one person who knew exactly how much she was carrying and exactly how to use it against her. She walked back through the corridor, and at the far end of the building, through the window that looked out over the compound, she could see the kennel field where Koda was visible through the fence, moving in slow, deliberate circles, the way working dogs moved when they were waiting for something they trusted was still coming. She pressed her palm flat against the cold glass for a moment, then she went back to work. But what she didn't yet know, what nobody in Margolis's office had known to tell her, because the information had arrived in the base's classified communications system 40 minutes after their meeting ended and had been routed to Brandt's office rather than Margolis's, was that Colonel Voss was not coming alone. She was bringing Koda's full Task Force Harlow operational file, the unredacted version. The unredacted file arrived at Brandt's office in a sealed transfer case at 6:47 in the evening, and by 7:15 Elena knew it existed even though she hadn't been told directly. She knew because Tomlin called her consultant quarters, not the office line, her personal room extension, and said only that Colonel Brandt had asked if Ms. Voss would be available for a brief meeting at 8 o'clock, and his voice had the particular texture of someone delivering a message they understood was more serious than its phrasing suggested. Elena said she'd be there. She changed her shirt, drank the rest of the cold coffee on her desk, and spent the 12 minutes before she had to leave sitting at the edge of the narrow bed in the consultant quarters, staring at nothing with the specific focus of someone doing rapid interior accounting. What she was counting was not fear exactly. She had enough distance from fear to recognize when it was operational and when it was noise. This was operational. The arrival of Harriet Voss with an unredacted file was not a neutral event, and Elena had spent enough time in institutional structures to understand what unredacted files were used for when they were deployed at meetings like the one scheduled for the following day at 0900. They were used to establish a version of events before anyone could establish a different one. She arrived at Brandt's office at 8 o'clock. Brandt was alone, which was the first useful piece of information. She had the transfer case on the desk beside her, but it was closed, which was the second. She gestured toward the chair and Elena sat, and they looked at each other for a moment with the mutual assessment of two people who had each decided the other was reasonably straightforward. Task Force Harlow's K9 Integration Operational Log, Brandt said, resting one hand on the case. Full version. Colonel Voss submitted it to program review as supporting documentation for their inquiry. She paused. She also filed a supplemental statement this afternoon claiming that your engagement at Iron Ridge represents an unauthorized reintroduction into a classified operational program. Elena kept her expression even. I was contracted through a civilian channel. There's nothing unauthorized about it. Her argument is that your prior involvement with Koda's original integration makes any evaluation you conduct a continuation of classified operational work rather than an independent civilian assessment. Brandt's tone was flat and professional. It's a thin argument, but it delays the IG referral while it's examined. Yes, Brandt said. It does. Elena looked at the case. Is there anything in the unredacted log that contradicts my account of my service? I've been through the executive summary. Brandt opened the case, removed a document, and held it in a way that indicated she was going to read from it rather than hand it over. The log documents your work on the K9 integration protocol in detail. It also documents a mission event from your final operational period that was redacted in the version available to civilian contractors. She looked up briefly. An extraction under fire. 3 K9 assets, 2 handlers. 1 handler was evacuated with critical injuries. 1 handler, Marcus Reel, did not survive. That's accurate, Elena said. The unredacted version includes a post-mission assessment filed by Colonel Voss. In it, she attributes the mission's complications in part to a protocol deviation on the part of the K9 integration specialist. Brandt let that land. That's you. Elena was very still. What deviation? She said. Her voice was level. She had practiced making her voice level. She claims you recommended extending Koda's deployment timeline against her advised schedule. That the dog's conditioning was, in her assessment, not mission-ready, and that your recommendation to proceed contributed to the outcome. The room was quiet. Elena looked at the wall to the left of Brandt's desk. Outside the window, Iron Ridge was dark except for the perimeter lighting, the kind of institutional dark that installations had at this hour. Not empty, just reduced to its essential functions. That assessment was not provided to me at separation, she said. No, Brandt said. I was given a commendation. Also in the file, Brandt said. Filed 2 weeks after the post-mission assessment by a different officer. She set the document down. I'm not here to argue the merits of either document tonight. I'm here because you need to understand what Voss is bringing into that room tomorrow and what it's going to be used to do. Discredit the IG referral by discrediting me, Elena said. Specifically, by establishing that your assessment of this program is the work of someone whose judgment has already been called into question in a classified operational context that most people in this building can't access or verify. Brandt folded her hands. It's not an elegant strategy, but it doesn't need to be elegant. It just needs to introduce enough uncertainty to delay the referral past the point where Ward's documentation issues can be addressed before his next evaluation cycle. Elena absorbed this. She had known Voss was not coming to help, but she had underestimated the specific shape of what she was bringing. What does Margolis know? She asked. The same as you. He's aware of the file and the supplemental statement. He's also made clear to me that his position on your professional standing at this installation hasn't changed. Brandt paused. He's a good commander. That's not always enough. No, Elena agreed. It's not. She left Brandt's office at 8:40 and walked back through the administrative corridor in the institutional quiet of a military base at night. The particular silence that wasn't absence of sound so much as reduction to the sounds that mattered. Ventilation, distant generators, the occasional radio transmission from overnight security. She pushed through the exterior door and stood in the cold for a moment. Then she walked to the kennel compound. Price was on overnight shift. He looked surprised to see her at this hour, but didn't say so, which she appreciated. Koda was in the interior space, and at the sound of her footsteps in the outer corridor, his movement stopped. She could hear it, the particular cessation of a large animal going still in a way that was different from sleep. She stood at the outer gate without going through. She wasn't there to run a session. She was there because the kennel was the one place on this installation where the situation was clear and the stakes were uncomplicated, where a damaged animal had made a simple decision about trust and was holding to it with more consistency than the institutional structures surrounding them were managing. She stood there for a while. Koda appeared at the interior gate and looked at her through the barrier, and neither of them needed to do anything else for the moment. She went back to her quarters and slept 3 hours and was at her desk by 4 in the morning with the rehabilitation proposal open and the task of making it as specific and technically thorough as possible. Because whatever happened in the meeting at 9 o'clock, the proposal was a document that would exist independently of the meeting, and documents had a way of surviving the rooms they were created in. Colonel Harriet Voss arrived at Iron Ridge at 8:15 in a staff vehicle with 2 aides and a program review officer named Garland, who had the studied neutrality of career bureaucrats who understood that their job was to observe and record rather than resolve. Voss herself was 61, lean in the way of people who maintained physical discipline as a professional habit rather than a personal one, with gray at her temples and the kind of posture that said she had not spent the last 30 years accommodating rooms that weren't prepared for her. Elena saw her crossing the parking area from the window of the behavioral research wing. She had known Voss for 6 years, known her the way that people know their commanding officers, which is to say with the specific combination of professional respect and personal wariness that the structure of military hierarchy produces when 2 people are perceptive enough to understand that they are not, at a fundamental level, operating from the same set of priorities. Voss had never been cruel. She had been effective and committed to the mission and willing to make the kinds of calculations that effective mission-committed officers made. Elena had agreed with those calculations approximately 80% of the time. The remaining 20 was where they'd developed the friction that neither of them had been required to fully resolve while Elena was in the unit, because the mission kept moving and resolution was a luxury that operational tempo didn't often offer. Now the mission had stopped moving, and resolution was apparently on the morning schedule. The meeting was in the main conference room on the first floor of the administrative building, a room large enough for the number of people who were going to be in it. Margulis sat at the head of the table. Brandt was to his right. Voss sat across from Brandt with Garland beside her and her aides positioned behind her in a way that was formally civilian, but arranged with military precision. 2 officers from the base's Inspector General Liaison Office sat along the far wall, present as observers. Elena sat at the table's midpoint. She had her notebook and a printed copy of the rehabilitation proposal. She had left her personal phone in her office because she didn't want the distraction of it, and because there was nothing in her messages that would help her this morning. Margulis opened the meeting with a formal statement of purpose that was procedurally correct and communicated in the specific language of institutional carefulness, that he was running this meeting and that the visitor from program review was here as an observer of a base-level proceeding rather than as an authority over it. Garland acknowledged this with a nod that conceded the point without surrendering anything. Then Voss spoke. She was precise. Elena had expected that. She presented the supplemental statement in summary, hitting the key points of her argument about unauthorized program continuation without repeating herself or embellishing, and when she referenced the post-mission assessment, she did so with the measured tone of someone who had rehearsed how to use a serious document without appearing to weaponize it. The K9 integration protocol developed by Ms. Voss was classified as an operational tool at the time of its development, Voss said. Her use of that protocol in an interaction with an active military working dog on a federal installation, absent current security clearance or formal program authorization, raises legitimate questions about the integrity of any assessment she has conducted here. Margulis looked at Elena. Ms. Voss? Elena opened her notebook. She had written 3 lines at the top of the first page, not as notes, but as a sequence, the order in which she was going to do this. The protocol I used with Koda, she said, was a behavioral command structure. It consists of 2 syllables delivered in a specific register. I developed it as part of my work with the integration unit. It's not a classified technology. It's not a weapon system or an intelligence method. It is a training cue. She kept her eyes on Voss. Characterizing it as classified operational material in this context would require characterizing every behavioral training technique developed under Task Force Harlow as classified, which would include standard reward conditioning, target training, and odor detection protocols that are published in open military training literature. Garland made a note. The post-mission assessment filed by Colonel Voss, Elena continued, attributes the mission outcome in part to my recommendation regarding Koda's deployment timeline. I'd like to address that directly. She paused, and the pause had weight in it. My operational log from that period, which was submitted to the unit's records at separation, documents a formal objection I raised to the mission timeline 3 days before deployment. I recommended a 2-week extension of Koda's conditioning cycle based on stress indicators I had documented over the prior month. That objection was noted and overruled. She looked at Voss steadily. By Colonel Voss. The room was quiet. Voss's expression didn't fracture. She was too experienced for that. But something behind it shifted in a way Elena recognized. The slight recalibration of a person who had walked into a room expecting the field to be arranged one way and found it arranged differently. The objection you're referencing, Voss said, with careful steadiness, was informal. It was written, Elena said, submitted through the unit's internal communication system on the 14th of the month, 11 days before the mission brief. Another pause. I'd need to review my records, Voss said. I have a copy, Elena said. She reached into the folder beside her notebook and slid a document across the table. It was a printout, slightly aged at the edges. The kind of thing that had been kept in a physical file because its owner understood that digital records in classified systems could be redacted and physical copies could not. Brandt looked at it without touching it. Garland looked at it and made another note, this one longer. Voss looked at it and said nothing. I'm not here to relitigate a mission from 3 years ago, Elena said. I'm here because an animal that had been rendered non-functional by 3 years of mismanagement responded to a rehabilitation approach that I am qualified to provide. And that response triggered an institutional defensive reaction that has now reached into a classified record to find grounds to dismiss my professional standing. She turned from Voss to Garland. The IG referral pending against this installation's K9 program documents is based on 5 specific documentation failures that have nothing to do with my prior operational history. I'd suggest that's the more productive focus for program review's time. Garland looked at her for a moment. The referral is not within the scope of today's meeting. No, Elena said. But it's within the scope of why today's meeting was convened. The silence that followed was the kind that institutional proceedings produced when someone in the room had said a true thing that the room structure wasn't designed to acknowledge. Margolis let it sit for a moment. Then he said, Colonel Voss, in your assessment, is there any current security concern related to Ms. Voss's presence at this installation or her interaction with the K9 asset? Voss picked up the document Elena had slid across the table. She looked at it for several seconds with the unhurried focus of someone buying themselves the time they needed to answer a question whose answer had just become significantly more complicated. I would need to review the communication record she's referenced, Voss said finally. That's not an answer to my question, Margolis said. Another pause. No, Voss said. There is no current security concern. The IG liaison officers along the far wall exchanged a glance that communicated something they kept off their faces. The meeting ended at 11:15 with no formal resolution and no formal escalation, which was itself a kind of outcome. Garland said program review would issue its assessment within 5 business days. Voss left with her aides and said nothing further to Elena directly, which Elena had expected. The lack of a parting exchange was its own communication. What Elena had not expected was that Ward would be waiting in the corridor outside the conference room. He looked rough, not unkempt, because Ward was the kind of person who maintained physical presentation as a matter of identity, but rough in the particular way of someone who hadn't been sleeping and was running on the fuel of an anger that had curdled into something more complicated. He had clearly been told that he wasn't permitted to attend the meeting, and the knowledge of what had happened inside it was reaching him through whatever corridor network had been delivering information since the demonstration. He fell in beside her as she walked. "I know what you did in there," he said, quietly enough that it wasn't a confrontation. "You came here with an agenda." Elena didn't stop walking. "I came here with a contract. You came here because someone told you what was wrong with my program and you saw an opportunity." She stopped then, turned to look at him. His face had a quality she recognized, not the professional performance of the briefing room, but something underneath it, the face of a man who was beginning to understand the actual dimensions of the situation he was in and finding them larger than he'd calculated. "Sergeant Ward," she said, "I came here because a dog that I helped train was suffering and nobody was doing anything about it that was working. That's it. That's the full story. You undermined my command. Your documentation undermined your command. I just read it." His jaw tightened. "That animal was uncontrollable before I got here." "He was grieving before you got here," Elena said. "And then your methods gave him something else to be." Ward looked at her with the expression of a man who had several responses available and couldn't find one that didn't confirm something he didn't want confirmed. His hands were at his sides, fingers not quite still. "What happens now?" he said. It wasn't entirely a question. "The IG referral goes forward," Elena said. "What happens after that depends on what the documentation actually shows. I didn't create those records, Sergeant. I just cross-referenced them." She started walking again. Behind her, she heard him stay where he was for a long moment, and then the sound of his footsteps going in a different direction. The afternoon was quieter than the morning, the particular quiet of an installation absorbing the aftermath of something significant that hadn't yet resolved into its final shape. Elena worked on supplemental documentation for the rehabilitation proposal, ate a sandwich at her desk that was mediocre in the specific way of base commissary food, and checked her personal phone to find 2 missed calls from a number she recognized as belonging to a former task force Harlow colleague named Dana Rice. She called back. Rice picked up on the second ring. "I heard Voss went to Iron Ridge." "She left this morning," Elena said. "How bad?" "Manageable." She brought the unredacted log. A pause. "Did she bring the real file?" Elena's hand tightened slightly on the phone. "What do you mean, the real file?" "There was a separate operational review filed after Marcus died," Rice said. Her voice had the quality of someone delivering information they've been sitting with for a while. "I only know about it because I was deposed, a month after you separated. It went nowhere as far as I know. But Lena, it existed, and Voss was the one who commissioned it." Elena was standing at her desk now, without having registered standing. "What was the scope of the review?" "K9 operational protocol. Specifically, whether the integration methods used on the mission were within authorized parameters." Another pause. "Specifically, your methods." Outside the window of the behavioral research wing, the late afternoon light had gone gray and flat, the kind of light that removed the landscape's depth and made everything look like a surface. "Did you testify?" Elena asked. "I gave a statement. I said your methods were sound. 3 other unit members said the same." Rice paused. "The review was closed without findings. But Lena, if Voss is at Iron Ridge with the unredacted log in the program review office, she may have brought that review too, as supplemental documentation." Elena was already moving toward the door. She needed to get back to Brandt's office. She was halfway down the corridor when her phone rang again. Not Rice's number, and not a base extension. An unfamiliar number with a federal area code she recognized as belonging to a specific part of Washington, D.C. She stopped walking. She answered. The voice on the other end was not Carver. It was a woman, older, with the precise diction of someone accustomed to being listened to on the first attempt. "Ms. Voss, I'm calling from the Office of the Inspector General, Federal Division. My name is Deputy Inspector Carla Morrow." A brief pause. "I need to speak with you directly before tomorrow morning, not through the base's communication system. In person, if possible." Elena looked down the corridor. Brandt's office was 40 feet away. "I'm at Iron Ridge," she said. "I know," said Morrow. "I'm at the main gate." Elena's hand holding the phone was completely still. The Deputy Inspector General did not make unannounced site visits to military installations over standard program documentation referrals. She came when something in the documentation was not standard at all. "Tell them I'll be there in 5 minutes," Elena said. She was already walking. Deputy Inspector Carla Morrow was not what Elena had been picturing during the 5-minute walk to the main gate. She had pictured someone bureaucratic in the way that federal oversight officials sometimes were, precise, contained, operating from behind the professional distance that institutional authority provided as both tool and armor. Morrow was precise, and she was contained, but the distance wasn't there. She was 63 or 64, with the kind of face that had been weathered by sustained attention to difficult things rather than by age alone. And she was standing outside the gate visitors area in a coat that was adequate for the temperature but not comfortable, which told Elena she had come quickly and hadn't planned the trip with leisure. She had one aide, a young woman named Vasquez who carried a hard-sided case and said nothing. "Ms. Voss," Morrow said, and offered her hand. Elena shook it. "Deputy Inspector? Is there somewhere we can speak privately? Not a base conference room and not an office that belongs to anyone currently under review." Elena thought for a moment. "There's a behavioral research space in the medical wing. It's mine for the duration of my contract." "That works." They walked without making conversation, which Elena appreciated. Morrow moved through the installation with the particular comfort of someone who had been inside many installations and was not easily impressed or intimidated by their architecture of authority. The aide, Vasquez, kept pace without looking around, which suggested she'd also done this before. In the behavioral research office, Morrow sat in the second chair and Vasquez stood near the door. Morrow looked at the desk, the printed rehabilitation proposal, the notebook, the stack of cross-referenced behavioral logs, with a briefly assessing glance that took in more than it appeared to. "I'll be direct," Morrow said. "The IG referral your assessment triggered flagged documentation anomalies in this installation's K9 program. My office was notified at the standard level. What escalated it to my direct involvement was a secondary notification we received 2 days ago from a source I'm not going to name." She folded her hands on her knee. "That source provided my office with a communication record showing that Colonel Harriet Voss contacted Program Review's director directly before the formal inquiry process had been initiated, before your referral had cleared the base level." Elena was still. "She contacted Program Review before the referral was filed," she said. "Before it was filed and before it was formally received by my office, which means she was informed of its existence through a channel that should not have had that information at that stage." Morrow's expression didn't dramatize anything. "That is itself a procedural violation. It suggests that someone inside this installation communicated the referral's contents to Voss before the proper notification process." "Ward," Elena said. "We're not at conclusions yet," Morrow said. "But the timeline is what it is." She paused. "What I need from you tonight is a full account of your interactions with this installation since your arrival, including your assessment methodology, your observations regarding program management, and the document you presented in this morning's meeting, the written objection from your task force Harlow period." "I have the original," Elena said. "Physical copy." Morrow looked at it when Elena retrieved it from the folder. She held it with both hands and read it fully, which took a minute and a half. The aide, Vasquez, photographed it with a device from the hard-sided case. "You kept this for 3 years," Morrow said. "I kept everything from that period." Elena said it without apology or explanation. Morrow handed the document back. "I want you to understand the scope of what my office is looking at now. The K9 program documentation failures are one thread. Voss's pre-referral contact with Program Review is a second. The possibility of a communication leak from within this installation is a third." She looked at Elena directly. "And the post-mission assessment Voss filed regarding your conduct, the one that appears to contradict a written record she had to have known existed, is a fourth." Elena absorbed the shape of it. 4 threads, all running back to the same point of origin. "She filed that assessment believing my objection letter wasn't retrievable," Elena said. "That would be a reasonable inference," Morrow said carefully. "She was protecting the mission record. If my objection letter establishes that I recommended against the deployment timeline and was overruled, then the mission outcome sits differently in the operational review." Elena paused. "Marcus Reel died on a timeline that I formally recommended against." The room was quiet. "The operational review that was conducted after Reel's death," Morrow said. "Were you informed of its existence at the time?" "No, I found out this afternoon from a former unit colleague." Morrow looked at Vasquez briefly. Something passed between them. That review's existence and its closure without findings is something my office will be examining. She stood, which meant the meeting was moving toward its conclusion. Ms. Voss, I want to be clear about something. You came to this installation to do a job. The job you did was competent and well documented. What followed is not your doing, and my office's interest is in the institutional failures that your presence here surfaced, not in creating additional difficulty for you. She picked up her coat. But I need you to stay at Iron Ridge until we complete our preliminary assessment. Can you do that? My contract runs another 12 days, Elena said, and Koda needs the work. Morrow almost smiled. It was a small movement, restrained by professional habit, but it was there. I'll be in touch in the morning. Don't discuss this conversation with anyone inside the base's reporting structure tonight. Not even Margolis? Especially not Margolis. Not because I doubt his integrity. I don't. But because I need one night without any of the relevant parties communicating with each other. She moved toward the door, then stopped. One more thing. The document you produced this morning stopped Voss's narrative before it could establish itself. That was well timed. I've had 3 years to think about when to use it, Elena said. Morrow looked at her for a moment, then she nodded once and left. Elena sat in her office for a long time after Morrow left, not working, just sitting with the particular stillness of someone who has been moving at high speed and has encountered an unexpected moment of held ground. The situation had shifted substantially in the last 8 hours. The IG referral, which Ward and Voss had both been working to delay and discredit, had instead escalated, not sideways into bureaucratic uncertainty, but upward, directly into the office of someone with the authority and apparent will to pull every thread simultaneously. She was not naive about what that meant for her. Being the source of an investigation was not the same as being its subject, but it was not comfortable either, and Morrow had been honest enough not to pretend otherwise. She went to the kennel compound at 9:15. Price had been briefed to allow her access at any reasonable hour, and he let her through without comment beyond a quiet observation that Koda had eaten his full afternoon portion for the second day running. Elena thanked him and went to the outer enclosure. She sat on the floor and Koda came to her within 4 minutes, faster than the first time, more directly. He settled beside her with the specific heaviness of a large animal choosing rest, and she put her hand on his back and left it there, and let the silence do what silence did when the day had been what the day had been. She thought about Marcus Real, which she had spent 3 years not doing in sustained ways, because sustained thinking about Marcus led to places that were not productive and were not ultimately fair to the living work still in front of her. Marcus had been good, genuinely good, at the work and at the kind of steadiness that working with these animals required. He had learned the command protocol without difficulty and adapted it in ways she hadn't anticipated, which was the mark of someone who understood not just the technique, but the principle behind it. Koda had loved him in the uncomplicated way that dogs loved handlers who had earned it. The way Koda was sitting beside her now was not the same as how he had been with Marcus, but it was in the same family of trust, and that meant something she couldn't fully articulate and didn't need to. She stayed for 40 minutes. Back in her quarters at 10:30, she set her alarm for 5 and lay down without sleeping for a while. Through the window, the installation's perimeter lights cut orange lines across the ceiling. She thought about the 4 threads Morrow had identified: documentation, pre-referral contact, communication leak, false assessment, and the way they all converged. She thought about Ward standing in the corridor with his hands not quite still. She thought about Voss reading the objection letter with the expression of someone who has found an unexpected obstacle on a path they thought they'd cleared. She slept eventually. The alarm woke her before it needed to. The morning began before most of the installation was active, and it broke open fast. At 6:40, Margolis received a formal notification from the Federal IG's office that Iron Ridge was subject to an expanded inquiry effective immediately, covering K9 program documentation, internal communication records from the prior 60 days, and command-level correspondence related to the civilian contractor engagement. The notification required him to preserve all relevant records and restricted modification of any program files pending review. Elena learned about it from Tomlin at 7:10 in the form of a message that said the commander was requesting her presence at 8 o'clock and that the base's legal office and 2 federal liaisons would also be present. She arrived at 7:55. The room had more people in it than the previous day's meeting. Margolis, Brandt, the two IG liaison officers from the far wall the day before, and two individuals in civilian clothes she didn't recognize but whose bearing marked them clearly as federal investigators. Ward was not present. Voss was not present. Margolis looked tired in the way of someone who had been making calls since before 6. He acknowledged Elena's arrival with a nod and moved directly to the matter. "The expanded inquiry notification arrived this morning," he said. "My office is cooperating fully. I've been informed that the inquiry's scope includes, among other things, a communication log showing contact between someone inside this installation and Colonel Voss's office in the 72 hours before the program review inquiry was formally initiated." He looked at the two federal investigators when he said this, not at Elena, which told her the information was already established, rather than preliminary. One of the investigators, a man named Haverford, who introduced himself briefly, took the floor. "We've identified the communication. It originated from a terminal in the K9 Division's administrative area. Time-stamped 48 hours before the referral cleared the base level." He paused. "The terminal was assigned to Sergeant Caleb Ward." The room absorbed this. Elena did not look triumphant, because she had enough experience with institutional proceedings to know that the feeling that wanted to be triumphant was not useful and was frequently premature. She looked at the table and kept her hands still. "Where's Sergeant Ward now?" Brandt asked. "He's been asked to remain in his quarters pending a formal interview," Haverford said. "He was notified at 0630. Margolis put both hands flat on the table. He was a man managing several things at once, and doing it with the practiced containment of long experience, but the weight of the morning was visible in the set of his shoulders. "Ms. Voss," he said, "I want to say directly, for the record, that this installation's request for your professional services was made in good faith and with appropriate authorization, and that the work you have conducted here has been both competent and valuable. Whatever the outcome of the current inquiry, that assessment stands." "Thank you, Commander," Elena said. "Your rehabilitation proposal." He looked at her. "The board review I'd planned for Friday. Given the current circumstances, it may need to be delayed." "I understand," Elena said. "The proposal doesn't go anywhere. Koda doesn't go anywhere. The timeline can adjust." One of the investigators made a note. Ward's formal interview was conducted in the base's legal office at 9:30 that morning. Elena was not present and was not told its full contents, but the shape of it reached her through the installation's informal networks by midday, with the particular speed of significant institutional events. What the communication log showed, in the end, was worse than a single unauthorized contact. Ward had sent 2 messages to a private account linked to Voss's aide before the referral was filed, and a third message to Program Review's administrative office, not through official channels, but through a personal contact he had there. The morning after Elena's assessment report was submitted to Margolis. The third message had included a summary of the report's findings and an explicit request that Program Review be prepared to receive a challenge to Elena's credibility. He had been working against the referral before the referral existed in any formal sense, before Elena had even left the compound after the demonstration. The timeline made the calculation visible. Ward had understood, watching Elena stop Koda in the field, that the demonstration had produced the opposite of what he'd intended. He'd gone from the compound to his administrative terminal within the hour, and he'd started making calls. What he had not counted on was that institutional communication systems logged everything, and that an expanded IG inquiry had the authority to access those logs without the kind of advance notice that would have allowed anyone to manage what was in them. Elena heard the shape of this from Tomlin, who delivered it in pieces across the middle part of the day, with the careful phrasing of someone who had spent too much of his professional life carrying information between people who were in conflict with each other and who was clearly relieved to be carrying something that felt, this time, like resolution rather than escalation. She was writing supplemental notes for the rehabilitation proposal when Tomlin delivered the last piece, that Morrison, Ward's senior handler, had provided a voluntary statement to the investigators that morning. A voluntary statement, which meant he had not been compelled to speak and had chosen to. Elena set her pen down. "What did he say?" Tomlin looked at his clipboard. "I don't know the specific content, but the interview ran 2 hours, and when he came out, he went directly to the commander's office and requested a formal reassignment." She picked her pen back up. "Okay?" Miss Voss? Tomlin hesitated. He had the expression of someone who has been professionally adjacent to a situation long enough to have developed opinions about it that exceeded his job description. I want to say, I know I'm just administrative staff. Tomlin, Elena said. You pulled the right files without being asked every time I needed them. You told me about the maintenance log. You called my room extension instead of my office line when it mattered. She looked at him. You're not just administrative staff. His expression did something complicated, in the way of people who are not accustomed to being seen accurately in professional settings. He nodded once and left. She went back to the proposal. The afternoon brought Colonel Voss. Not in an official capacity. That meeting, whatever form it would take, was still being arranged through formal channels. Voss appeared in the corridor outside Elena's office at 2:15 without her aides, in the specific way of someone who has decided to do something without the structure that allows for deniability, which was itself a communication about where she was positioned by that point in the day. Elena heard her in the corridor before she appeared in the doorway, because Voss had a particular way of walking that Elena had spent 2 years learning to recognize, measured, deliberate, the walk of someone who always knew exactly where they were going and was committed to the direction even when the direction had become untenable. She stood in the doorway. Elena looked up from the proposal. Neither of them spoke for a moment. The objection letter, Voss said finally. Her voice had none of the meeting's precision in it. It was flat in a way that wasn't professional. It was the flatness of a person who has been running a calculation for several hours and has reached an answer they didn't intend to reach. I didn't know you'd kept it. I kept everything, Elena said, which she'd said tomorrow, and which was the same true thing in a different room. I filed that post-mission assessment because the mission review required a causal account, Voss said. Someone had to provide one. Someone did, Elena said. You just made sure it was someone who wasn't in a position to contradict you. Voss's jaw tightened. That's not what I was 2 weeks out from a field injury that cost me full use of 2 fingers on my left hand and partial hearing in 1 ear, Elena said, and she said it without raising her voice, which was harder than raising it would have been. I was separated, my clearance was in transition, my access to the unit's communication system was restricted. You filed the assessment during a window when I had no practical ability to respond to it. She paused. I don't think you did it maliciously. I think you did it because it was the cleanest way to close the record and move on. But it cost me 3 years of professional standing, and it sat in a sealed file being used as a weapon this week by someone who commissioned it and then had the convenience of forgetting it existed until she needed it. Voss stood in the doorway for a long moment. What do you want? She said, and the question was stripped of the formal register she'd been operating in since she arrived at Iron Ridge. It was a direct question from one person to another in the specific way of people who have run out of institutional language. Elena looked at her. I want the operational review that was conducted after Marcus Reel's death to be accurately closed. I want the post-mission assessment corrected to reflect the written objection that contradicts it. And I want Koda's rehabilitation to proceed without interference from anyone who has a stake in the K9 program's prior management remaining unexamined. And the IG inquiry? Is not mine to stop, Elena said. I didn't start it. My assessment triggered a referral that the documentation warranted. What happens from here is between your record and the investigators. Voss looked at her for another moment. Something in her face had the quality of a person doing a particular kind of accounting. Not strategic, but something closer to honest, which was harder and less practiced. You were right about the timeline, Voss said. The deployment. I knew you were right when you submitted the objection. The operational pressure was... She stopped. There's no version of that sentence that improves the situation. No, Elena agreed. There isn't. Voss left without another word, and Elena sat with the particular quality of a silence that follows the resolution of something that has been unresolved for a very long time. It was not satisfying in the simple way she might have imagined 3 years ago. It was real and complicated and had the texture of actual things rather than anticipated ones, which was its own kind of completion. By 4 o'clock, the formal contours of Ward's situation had taken shape. Haverford's team had completed their communication log review and submitted preliminary findings to Margolis's office. Ward was formally relieved of command duties pending the inquiry's completion. Margolis signed the order at 3:47, and the base's notification system delivered it to the K-9 Division's active personnel roster at 4:15. Tate, who was the remaining junior handler of the original three, and who had been the one to file the sixth-month incident under maintenance rather than behavioral records, was placed on administrative restriction pending a separate interview scheduled for the following morning. Elena heard about the relief order from Brandt, who called her office line at 4:30 with the specific brevity of someone delivering information to a person who has been owed it. "Ward's been removed from operational authority," Brandt said. "The inquiry documentation will be finalized over the next several days. Deputy Inspector Morrow's office has formally absorbed the case at the federal level, which means the base-level IG process transfers to her jurisdiction." "What about Voss?" "Her supplemental statement to program review is under review given the timeline irregularities. Program review's director, who received Ward's pre-referral communication, has also been notified that his role in the process is being examined." A brief pause. "It has been a busy day." Elena almost laughed. "Yes." "Your rehabilitation proposal," Brandt said. "Margolis wants to schedule the board review for next week. He'd like this settled before the installation's next command review cycle, and frankly, so would I." "I'll have the supplemental sections finished tonight," Elena said. "Good." Another pause, shorter. "You did good work here, Ms. Voss. I don't say that lightly, and I don't say it to people who haven't earned it." The call ended. Elena sat for a moment. Then she picked up her pen and went back to the proposal. She was at the kennel compound at 6 in the evening, which was becoming something Price had started preparing for in his own small ways. The second chair was always there now, the gate controls checked ahead of her arrival. The session that evening was different from the ones before. Not because Koda was different. He came to her with the same economy of trust he'd been developing, settled with the same particular heaviness, accepted the contact with the same careful steadiness. But Elena was different. The weight she'd been carrying through the meetings and the communications and the careful management of institutional pressures had not disappeared, but it had shifted into a position she could actually carry rather than one she was simply enduring. She worked with him for the first time with specific rehabilitation goals rather than just presence building. Basic command responses. Not the full protocol from the integration days, but foundational structures that she could layer the more specific work onto. He was responsive in ways that the behavioral logs hadn't predicted, because the behavioral logs had been built on 3 years of documentation by people who didn't know what they were looking at. At the end of the session, when she moved to stand, Koda stood with her and leaned his weight briefly against her leg. A small thing, the kind of gesture that working dogs made when they had decided something. And then he moved away and went to his water bowl with the matter-of-fact purposefulness of an animal who had other things to do now. Price, from his position near the wall, said, "Huh," very quietly. Elena walked back through the compound corridor and out into the evening, and the cold air and the perimeter lights, and the sounds of the installation were what they always were, unchanged by any of the day's events in the way that places were always unchanged by the human events that occurred within them. She was nearly to the administrative building when her phone rang. "Morrow." She answered. "Ms. Voss, I wanted to update you before the day closed." Morrow's voice had the same quality as the previous evening, direct, unornamented. "Ward's communication log has produced something we weren't expecting." Elena stopped walking. "Beyond the contacts we've already identified," Morrow continued, "there are 2 additional communications sent from his terminal in the 48 hours after your assessment was submitted. One to Voss's aide, which we've already logged. One to an address we're still verifying." A pause that was a fraction longer than her previous pauses. "The content of the second communication includes a portion of your classified task force Harlow service record, information that should not have been accessible from Ward's security level." The cold was very present suddenly. Elena was aware of it in her hands, in the air moving through the corridor behind her. "How did he access it?" she said. "That's what we're determining," Morrow said. "But Ms. Voss, the address he sent it to belongs to a journalist, a defense and security correspondent with a national publication." Elena stood in the middle of the path between the kennel compound and the administrative building, and the perimeter lights threw long orange shadows across the ground, and she understood with the specific clarity of someone who has been in enough institutional situations to recognize the shape of the worst one that the day had not, after all, reached its final event. Ward had not just tried to delay the referral, he had tried to bury her, and he had sent the shovel to someone with a printing press. The story was already out there, and she had no idea what version of her it told. She stood on that path for 11 seconds. She counted them without intending to, the way people counted things in moments of high stress, because the brain needed something concrete to hold on to while it processed the thing that was actually happening. The perimeter lights. The cold. The sound of Morrow's voice still in her ear after the call ended. 11 seconds, and then Elena Voss put her phone in her pocket and started walking. Not fast, not slow, the same measured pace she'd used in every corridor of this installation since she arrived, because panic was a decision and she wasn't making it. She called Morrow back before she reached the administrative building. "What's been published?" she asked. "Nothing yet, as of 30 minutes ago," Morrow said. "We've had our media monitoring team checking since we identified the recipient. The journalist received the communication 4 days ago. If he was going to publish immediately, he would have." "That means he's verifying," Elena said, "or waiting for something." "Both, most likely. Defense correspondents at that publication don't run single-source stories on classified service records. They need corroboration or a second document." A pause. "Which means there's a window." "How wide?" "Narrow. Days, not weeks. Publications in this space move fast when they have something they believe is solid." Morrow's voice had the quality of someone managing several simultaneous threads. "My office is consulting with the Defense Department's media liaison about the classification status of the specific information Ward transmitted. If the classification holds, there may be grounds to request a publication hold pending review. That process takes time." "What's in the communication? What specifically did he send?" Another pause, this one deliberate. "A summary of the post-mission assessment Voss filed, the version that attributes the mission complications to your recommendations, without the context of your objection letter or the subsequent operational review." Elena stopped outside the administrative building's exterior door. The cold was settling into its evening register now, the sharp, specific cold of a military installation in open country after the sun had gone. She understood the architecture of what Ward had done with the clarity of something seen from sufficient altitude. He had taken the most damaging piece of a sealed record, stripped it of its contradicting evidence, and sent it to someone whose job was to find stories and information like this. He had done it before the referral was filed, when he still believed he might be able to prevent the institutional process from reaching him, and then he had apparently not thought about it again, or had thought about it, and decided that the journalist held his insurance regardless of how the institutional process went. It was the act of a person who understood that institutional accountability had limits, and who had decided to operate in the space beyond those limits. "The objection letter," Elena said. "If I provide it directly to the journalist, that would be irregular," Morrow said, "and potentially problematic for the inquiry." "It's not classified," Elena said. "It's an internal unit communication from my service period. I'm the author. I retained a physical copy. There's no classification marking on it." A longer pause. "I can't advise you on that course of action," Morrow said carefully. "I also can't prevent a private citizen from communicating with a journalist about their own service record." Elena understood the space between those two sentences. "What's his name? The journalist?" "Philip Oates, National Defense Correspondent, Vanguard Tribune." "Thank you," Elena said. She went inside. She found Philip Oates's contact information through the publication's website in 4 minutes, sitting at her desk with the rehabilitation proposal still open on the screen beside the browser window. He had a listed email and an office phone, and she used the office phone because journalists who received calls on their office line were more likely to be in a position to speak than those who received emails, and because she needed to move at the speed the situation required. He answered on the third ring. "Oates. My name is Elena Voss," she said. "I believe you recently received a communication concerning my military service record." A brief silence on his end. Not surprised, more the silence of a person whose professional instincts had just engaged at full capacity. "Ms. Voss, Yes, I'm aware of who you are." "Then you know the communication you received is a partial account." "I know that any single-source document on a sealed service record requires significant verification," he said. His voice was careful in the professional way of journalists who understood that the way they spoke in a first conversation shaped everything that followed. "I haven't published anything." "I know. I'm calling because what was sent to you omits a document that directly contradicts the assessment's central claim. I'm the author of that document. It's not classified, it was never sealed, and I retained a physical copy. She paused. I'm not calling to kill a story. I'm calling because if you publish what you received without the full context, you'll publish something that's factually incomplete in ways that will require a correction. I'd rather you have everything before you decide what to do with any of it. Another silence, shorter this time. What's the document? A written objection I submitted to my commanding officer 11 days before the mission described in the assessment you received. It formally recommended against the deployment timeline and was overruled. The assessment you received omits that objection entirely. Can you provide the document? I can. Tonight, if you're available. Oates was quiet for a moment that had the particular texture of a journalist deciding how much of their process to make visible. Ms. Voss, I want to be transparent with you about something. The communication I received came with a secondary document, a claim that you were using a classified operational protocol at a federal installation without current clearance. That claim is also being examined by the Federal Inspector General's office, Elena said, who is on site at Iron Ridge and has determined, as of today, that the protocol in question does not constitute classified material under the relevant statutes. She kept her voice level. I can put you in contact with Deputy Inspector Morrow's office for verification. Oates made a sound that might have been the beginning of something he decided not to say. Then, I'll need to see the document and verify its provenance. If everything is what you're describing, I'm going to want to write a different story than the one I was set up to write. That's your decision, Elena said. I'm not asking you to write anything specific. I'm asking you to have the complete information. Fair enough, he said. Send it to my secure submission address. I'll compare it against the communication I received and come back to you within 24 hours. He gave her the address. She photographed the objection letter with her phone and submitted it through the secure portal he'd described within 15 minutes of ending the call. Then she sat for a moment with the specific feeling of someone who has extended as far as they can extend and now has to wait for the world to do what the world does. She went back to the rehabilitation proposal and worked until midnight. The next 3 days moved in 2 registers simultaneously, the formal institutional process grinding forward with its procedural thoroughness, and the separate, less controllable process of information moving through the world outside the installation's fence. On the institutional side, the sequence was methodical. Ward's formal interview produced a statement that was, by Brandt's account, characterized more by what it omitted than what it contained. He acknowledged the communications to Voss's aide and to program review, but characterized them as professional consultations rather than unauthorized disclosures, a framing that the communication log's content made difficult to sustain. The interview with Tate the following morning was shorter and produced a voluntary disclosure that the maintenance-filed incident report had been Ward's explicit instruction, relayed verbally, which Tate had followed and subsequently regretted with the particular regret of someone who had understood at the time that they were being asked to do something wrong and had done it anyway. Morrison's voluntary statement, when its full contents were shared with Brandt, turned out to be more comprehensive than the 2-hour interview duration had suggested. He had documented, from memory, 4 incidents over an 18-month period in which Ward had either directed the falsification of behavioral records or had directly altered documentation after the fact. He had kept no written record of these incidents at the time. He hadn't been brave enough for that, he apparently said in the interview, in the specific language of a person choosing honesty about their own failures. But his account was consistent, specific, and corroborated by the gaps Elena had identified in the original behavioral logs. On the 3rd morning, Deputy Inspector Morrow held a formal briefing in the base's main conference room that included Margolis, Brandt, the IG liaison officers, and Elena. She laid out the inquiry's preliminary findings with the same unornamented directness she'd applied to every communication since her arrival. Ward was being referred for federal charges on 2 counts: unauthorized disclosure of restricted personnel information and deliberate falsification of official military records. The referral would be processed through the military justice system in parallel with the federal inquiry. His relief from command duties was permanent, not pending. Program Review's director, who had received Ward's pre-referral communication and had acted on it by fast-tracking the inquiry into Elena's credentials, was being referred to his agency's ethics board. His involvement did not rise to the level of criminal referral, but it would be a career-defining event in the direction that career-defining events went when they involved an ethics board. Colonel Voss's supplemental statement and the post-mission assessment she had filed 3 years earlier were both under formal review by the Task Force Harlow Oversight Committee, which had been notified of the objection letter's existence and its omission from the operational record. The specific outcome of that review was outside Morrow's jurisdiction, but Morrow noted that the Oversight Committee had requested a full account from Voss within 10 days. The classified operational review conducted after the death of Marcus Reel, Morrow said, looking at Elena briefly, is being reopened. The closure without findings will be re-examined in light of the communication record that establishes the objection letter's existence at the time of the review. You will be notified of the process and given the opportunity to provide a formal statement. Elena nodded. Your professional assessment of this installation's K-9 program, Morrow continued, has been reviewed by my office and found to be competent, thorough, and free of any conflict of interest that would compromise its findings or recommendations. She looked at the room. The rehabilitation proposal submitted by Ms. Voss will proceed to board review on the schedule Commander Margolis has established. The meeting ended 40 minutes later. People move toward the door in the particular way of individuals who have just sat through something significant and need a moment before they can talk to each other normally. Margolis caught Elena's eye as he passed and gave her the specific nod of a person who has been fighting the right side of something and is relieved that the fight has reached a recognizable conclusion. Brandt stopped beside her. Morrow's office will issue a formal statement of findings when the inquiry closes. That statement will be public record, meaning anyone who received a partial account has access to the complete one, Elena said. That's generally how public records function, yes, Brandt said, and the dryness in her voice was the closest she had come to humor in their entire acquaintance. Philip Oates called at 2 in the afternoon on the 4th day. Elena was in the kennel compound when her phone rang, sitting on the floor of the outer enclosure with Koda working through a targeted response sequence that had, in the last 2 sessions, begun to show the shape of a dog finding his operational footing again. Not recovered. Recovery was a longer arc than 2 weeks could produce, but reoriented, moving with a purpose that had been absent for 3 years. She stepped out of the enclosure and answered. I verified the objection letter, Oates said. I had 2 independent analysts look at the document authentication and cross-reference the internal communication timestamp against the unit's archived system logs, which the IG's office provided under the inquiry access. A pause. The letter is exactly what you said it was. I know, Elena said. I also spoke with Deputy Inspector Morrow's communications liaison, and I've reviewed the preliminary findings summary that will be entering public record. His voice had the quality of a journalist who has spent several days with a story that kept becoming a different story, and who has arrived at the version that is actually true and is managing the complexity of that. The piece I'm writing is not the piece I was sent material to write. What is it? A story about a military K-9 rehabilitation program that was systematically mismanaged, documented fraudulently, and then defended through the unauthorized disclosure of a veteran's sealed service record when the mismanagement was identified by an outside evaluator. He paused. And about the evaluator. Elena watched Koda through the enclosure gate. I was working the targeting sequence on his own, running it without her direction, the self-initiated behavior of a dog who had internalized a structure and was testing it for himself. You don't need my permission for the public record elements, she said. No, Oates agreed. But I'd like to ask you some questions on record if you're willing, about the rehabilitation work, about what you found here and what you think needs to change. Another pause. Not about Task Force Harlow, unless you choose to address it. That's your call entirely. Elena was quiet for a moment. She thought about the 3 years between Marcus Reel's death and her arrival at Iron Ridge, the consulting work she'd built in the gap, the careful professional rebuild, the maintenance of everything she knew about this work. In the space of a contracted civilian life that looked nothing like what she'd trained for and was, underneath its modest surface, the continuation of the same thing by a different name. She thought about what it would mean to have that work visible, accurately, in a form that people outside this installation could read. Not for herself exactly. The wanting of recognition was a complicated thing and she'd spent enough time with it to know its shape, but for what the work was, for what the methodology represented. For every animal in a program like this one that had a ward-shaped problem and no one who spoke the right language. "I'm willing," she said. The interview took an hour and a half, conducted over the phone in the small cleared room in the behavioral research wing where she'd done her initial assessment work. Oates was a good interviewer. He listened more than he prompted, and when he asked questions, they were specific and showed the preparation of someone who had done the technical reading before picking up the phone. She talked about the rehabilitation framework, about the behavioral indicators that the program had misread, about the specific way that military working dogs processed grief and disorientation, which was not so different from the way humans did and was ignored for the same reasons. She talked about Koda without sentimentality and without simplification, because the real story of the dog was more interesting than either of those things. A working animal of exceptional training, exceptional capability, and genuine damage, who had found one reference point in 3 years of an environment that made no sense to him, and had held on to it with the fidelity that working dogs brought to everything that they had decided mattered. She did not talk about Task Force Harlow. She talked at the end about what she thought needed to change, not just at Iron Ridge, but across the structures that govern military canine programs, the documentation standards, the oversight gaps, the absence of any rehabilitation pathway for animals classified as non-deployable but not destroyed, the specific institutional blindness that allowed a program to be run badly for years because the people running it had enough rank to make the bad running invisible. When the interview ended, Oates said, "One more thing, off record if you prefer. Why did you come here? Specifically this dog?" Elena looked at the wall of the small room. "Because I knew what the problem was," she said, "and I knew how to address it, and nobody else was doing it. That's on record, if you'll let me use it," Oates said. "Yes," she said. "What?" The article ran 6 days later. It was published online at 6 in the morning and in the print edition the following day, and it was long, the kind of length that publications reserved for investigations they were confident in, the kind that included document reproductions and sidebar context, and the specific structural weight of something that had been reported carefully. Elena read it in her office before 6:30, in the particular quiet of an installation that was not yet at full activity. Oates had done exactly what he'd said he was doing. The story was accurate, specific, and contextual in all the ways that the communication ward had sent him had not been. It named ward by name and rank. It named program reviews director and described the ethics board referral. It described the documentation failures, the communication log, the timeline that showed the pre-referral contact. It quoted Morrow's public record statement. It quoted Elena on the rehabilitation work and on what needed to change. It did not name Voss because Voss's situation was still in the formal review process, and Oates had made the judgment call that naming her before that process concluded would be inaccurate rather than incomplete. Elena respected that, even though Voss's absence from the story felt, for a moment, like an unresolved note in a chord. She put her phone down and looked out the window at the installation in the early light. Her phone started ringing 40 minutes later and did not substantively stop for the rest of the day. Former colleagues, professional contacts, 2 journalists from other publications, a program director from a sister installation who wanted to discuss applying her rehabilitation framework, and near the end of the morning, a call from a number she didn't recognize that turned out to be a representative from the Defense Medical Behavioral Programs Office, the civilian body through which her contract had been arranged. The representative's name was Dr. Ansel Varga, and he was the kind of administrator who spoke in the measured, thoughtful cadences of someone who had spent his career building programs carefully and who recognized, in the rare instances when the opportunity arose, that circumstances had produced something worth building on. "We've been following the inquiry at Iron Ridge closely," Varga said, "and we've read the Vanguard Tribune piece this morning." A brief pause. "Ms. Voss, I want to be direct with you. The behavioral rehabilitation methodology you've applied here, the framework in your proposal, it's not just applicable to this installation. We've had K9 programs at 4 other facilities flagged for behavioral crisis situations in the last 2 years that we haven't had adequate resources to address." Another pause, this one with the quality of a person approaching the actual point. "I'd like to discuss a formal program development role, not a consulting contract, a structural position within the Defense Medical Behavioral Programs framework, with the authority to set rehabilitation standards across installations, train handlers, and design the oversight protocols that would prevent a situation like Iron Ridge from developing in the first place. Elena was quiet for a moment. She had not been expecting this, which meant she hadn't prepared a response for it, which meant she was going to have to think in real time rather than from a considered position. She found she didn't mind that. Real-time thinking, in her experience, produced more honest answers than considered ones sometimes did. What would the role look like operationally, she asked. Varga described it. It was substantial, more authority than she'd held since Task Force Harlow, and in some ways more than she'd held then, because it was authority over a methodology rather than over a single operational context. She would be building something from a foundation rather than working within an existing structure. The work would be harder and slower and less immediately visible than field work, and it would produce results that played out over years rather than weeks. It was, she thought, the job that should have existed 3 years ago. I'll need to finish the work here first, she said. Koda's rehabilitation has another 4 to 6 weeks minimum before I'd consider his progress stable enough to transition to a permanent handler. Of course, Varga said. We're not in a hurry. We've waited this long. A few more weeks won't change the need. He paused. I'd also like you to know that the role is being offered at a level that reflects your actual qualifications and experience. The full record, not the partial version that's been in circulation. She understood what he meant by that. The post-mission assessment, the sealed record, the 3 years of professional recalibration that had followed a document she hadn't known existed until it was used against her. The full record, once the operational review was corrected, told a different story than the partial one. I'll need to think about it, she said. Take the time you need, Varga said. You know where to reach me. She found Ward that afternoon. Not deliberately. She was crossing the administrative corridor toward Brandt's office for a final review of the inquiry documentation when she came around a corner and he was there, coming from the opposite direction with a box of personal items from the K9 Division's office that had the specific look of objects being carried out of a space a person would not be returning to. They stopped. The box was between them in an inadvertent way, held at Ward's chest, and he looked at her over the top of it with an expression that had none of the professional performance she'd watched him maintain through every earlier exchange. He looked tired and diminished in the specific way of people who have been running on the fuel of an identity that has collapsed, and who are now in the earliest, most disorienting stage of figuring out who they are without it. Elena had thought about this moment, or some version of it, in the abstract. She had not expected to feel much because she had done enough processing of the situation over the past weeks that the sharp edges had been worn to something more navigable. But looking at him now, the box, the tiredness, the absence of the authority he'd been performing since she walked into that first briefing room, she felt something she hadn't prepared for, which was the complicated human experience of watching a person face the consequences of choices they'd made, while also being able to see clearly that those choices had come from a place of fear rather than malice. Ward had been afraid of being exposed as inadequate, afraid of an outside evaluator dismantling the structure he'd built around his own limitations, afraid of what the documentation showed and afraid of what a woman in a civilian coat might find in records he'd been managing since before she arrived. Fear, in her experience, produced worse behavior than malice, because malice at least had a logic you could follow. Fear just produced damage in all directions. She didn't say any of that. Sergeant Ward, she said. He looked at her. His jaw worked for a moment. Then, I was wrong about you, from the first minute. It was not an eloquent statement. It didn't address the communications, or the documentation, or the 3 years of mismanagement, or the journalist, or any of the specific wrongs that had specific names and specific consequences. It was what a person said when they had run out of the sophistication that had sustained them and were left with only what was actually true. I know, Elena said. She moved past him and continued down the corridor, and she heard him stand there for a moment and then heard his footsteps going in the other direction, and she did not look back. She didn't need to. She wasn't carrying anything that required her to. The board review of the rehabilitation proposal happened on a Thursday morning, 2 weeks after Morrow's briefing. It was attended by Margolis, Brandt, 2 members of the Defense Medical Behavioral Programs Advisory Board, who had flown in specifically for it, Dr. Varga, who Elena had not expected in the room, and whose presence communicated something about the institutional weight being placed on the outcome. and a colonel from the Joint K-9 Program Office whose name was Adara Stills, a woman in her 50s with a direct manner and the specific expertise of someone who had spent 30 years in military animal programs and knew exactly what she was looking at when she read a rehabilitation framework. Elena presented for 40 minutes. She used no slides. She talked through the methodology, the behavioral science underlying it, the specific application to Koda's case as a demonstration of the framework's viability, and the scalability she believed it had across program types and animal histories. She talked about the oversight gaps the proposal addressed and the documentation standards it established. And she talked about what the rehabilitation of a single working dog looked like when it was done correctly versus what it looked like when it was done with the wrong tools by people who understood control but not communication. Stills asked the most questions, and they were the right questions. Specific, technically grounded, and occasionally challenging in ways that Elena had not anticipated, which meant she had to think rather than recite. She appreciated that. The board deliberated for 25 minutes, which was short enough to communicate that the outcome was not genuinely in question and long enough to satisfy the procedural requirements of a formal review. They approved the proposal unanimously. Varga shook her hand after the room cleared and said, "I'll take that as your answer about the role." And Elena said, "You can take it as a serious consideration," which he received with the expression of someone who had heard a more conditional form of yes and recognized it as still being a yes. She was at the kennel compound at 5:30 that evening. The session with Koda was the best one yet, which she registered not with celebration, but with the professional satisfaction of watching something work the way it was designed to work. He ran the full targeted sequence, held his positions on command, recalled cleanly, and at the end of the session did something she hadn't cued. He found the tug toy that had been sitting in its packaging in the corner of the outer enclosure since before she arrived, picked it up, and carried it to where she was sitting, dropping it in her lap with the matter-of-fact communication of a dog who has decided that play is possible again. She held the toy for a moment. Then she picked it up and they played, and Koda was not graceful about it. He was too intense and too rusty, and he knocked her sideways at one point with the full weight of his enthusiasm, and she landed on her elbow on the concrete and said something under her breath that was not professional, and Price made a sound from the wall that was definitely a laugh. And Koda stood over her with the toy still in his mouth, looking at her with the frank animal puzzlement of a creature who could not understand why the game had stopped. "I'm fine," she told him, getting up. He dropped the toy at her feet and waited. She picked it up. They kept playing. The formal clearing of her Task Force Harlow operational record came 6 weeks after the board review, in a letter from the Oversight Committee that was 6 pages of procedural language wrapping a single essential finding. The post-mission assessment filed by Colonel Voss had been determined to be materially incomplete in its failure to reference Elena's written objection, and the operational review conducted after Marcus Reel's death was being formally closed with a supplemental finding that the integration protocol she had developed was within authorized parameters and had functioned as designed. The mission outcome, the letter noted with the careful language of institutional documents, was attributable to operational timeline decisions made at the command level, and no fault in the protocol or its application had been identified. She read the letter twice, then she folded it and put it in the same folder as the original objection letter, where it sat with the quality of something that had needed to be in that folder for 3 years. Voss's review by the Oversight Committee resulted in a formal letter of censure and a requirement to complete remedial documentation training, outcomes that were, in the hierarchy of institutional consequences, less severe than Elena's lawyer had suggested were possible, and more severe than Voss's previous insulation from accountability might have predicted. The censure was in Voss's permanent record. It would be there when she retired and when anyone with appropriate access pulled her file in the future, which was not nothing. It was not enough either, in the clean mathematical sense that justice rarely was. But it was real, and it was documented, and it could not be redacted by anyone. Ward's federal charges were in process through the military justice system. His case would not resolve for months, possibly longer. But his removal from command was permanent, his professional record was what it was, and the story that Oates had published was in the searchable public record, attributed to named sources, and would be there for anyone who looked. She had stopped wanting it to be more than that sometime in the 3rd week after the article ran. Not because she had made peace with the imperfection of institutional outcomes. She hadn't, entirely, and suspected she never fully would, but because her attention had moved to the work, which was where it had always done its most useful things. The day she left Iron Ridge, she spent the morning in two places. The first was Margolis's office, where she delivered the final version of the transition documentation, the complete rehabilitation protocol, handler training guidelines, behavioral assessment standards, and maintenance schedule for Koda's continued work with the new permanent handler she had spent the last 3 weeks training. The handler's name was Specialist Dara Wynn, 27 years old, with an instinct for this kind of work that was almost frustrating in how naturally it came to her, and who had learned the command structure, not the original 2 syllables, which belonged to a different history, but the adapted version Elena had developed during the rehabilitation, with the ease of someone who understood the principle and not just the technique. Wynn had made Koda do the thing with the tug toy on her 3rd solo session. Elena had watched through the observation window and had felt, in a complicated and inarticulate way, something that was close to completion. Margolis accepted the documentation, shook her hand with the seriousness he brought to things that deserved it, and said, "If the program you're building at the federal level ever needs a pilot installation, I hope you'll consider us." She said she would. The second place was the kennel compound. She went at 10 in the morning when the light was good and the air had the particular quality of a day that had decided to be clear. Wynn was there, running a session, and stepped back without being asked when Elena came through the outer gate. Koda saw her from across the enclosure and came directly, no hesitation, no assessment pause. I was moving like himself, the specific, efficient movement of a working dog who knew where he was going and was entirely committed to the direction. He reached her and pressed his head briefly against her sternum in the way he had developed over the past weeks, the specific greeting of a dog who had a language for this now, and then he stood back and looked at her. She crouched down to his level. She looked at him for a moment. The operational precision of him, the history in the way his body held itself, the specific evidence of the last few weeks in how he stood now versus how he'd stood when she first saw him through the barrier. She thought about Marcus, which she could do now without the acute weight of the first years, with the particular kind of remembering that settled into something livable. She said the command one last time, the 2 syllables, the specific register, the context of everything behind it. Koda's ears came forward, his tail moved. Not exuberant, not performative, just present. She put her hand on the side of his face for a moment. Then she stood up and looked at Wynn, who was watching with the attentiveness of a handler who understood she was watching something she needed to hold on to. "He'll be okay," Elena said. "I know," Wynn said. She meant it, and it was the right thing to say. Elena walked out of the compound and back through the kennel corridor and out into the clear morning, and she kept walking without looking back. Not because looking back was wrong, but because the direction that mattered was forward, and she had enough practice making that choice to do it without forcing it. She had been dismissed. She had been misread, misfiled, reduced to a surface. A nurse, a civilian, a woman without a uniform carrying a worn bag and a piece of paper through a gate where nobody was expecting her. She had been handed as a professional challenge, an animal that the people responsible for him had decided was beyond the reach of care, and she had recognized in that animal what people had failed to recognize in her. Not brokenness, but a grief that had been misnamed and mishandled, and was waiting, with the fidelity of something trained to wait, for the one person who spoke the right language. The lesson, if there was one she was willing to draw from it, was not that the institutions eventually got it right. Sometimes they did, imperfectly, because enough people inside them decided that the truth was less work than the cover. But the lesson she was actually carrying forward, the one she intended to build a program on, the one she would say out loud to the handlers she was going to train, was simpler and less flattering to institutions and more useful in the actual practice of the work. The thing that looked dangerous because it wouldn't comply was often the thing that had simply run out of reasons to trust. The thing that looked broken was often the thing that had survived more than anyone had acknowledged and was waiting to be approached correctly. And the person who could do the approaching, who had the patience and the knowledge and the willingness to stand quietly at the barrier until the animal decided you were real, was rarely the loudest voice in the room. She had never been the loudest voice in any room she'd entered. It had cost her, and it had also, in the ways that eventually mattered, been exactly right. The car she'd arranged was waiting at the main gate. She put her bag in the back, told the driver she was ready, and watched Iron Ridge get smaller in the passenger window as they pulled away from the gate and onto the long access road that led back toward the world outside the fence. Her phone was in her pocket. Varga's number was in it, and Oates's, and Wynn's, and Morrow's, and a half dozen others that had not been there when she arrived 3 weeks ago. The proposal was approved, and the role was waiting, and the work, the actual work, the thing she was built for, was just beginning in a form that could reach further than a single installation, a single animal, a single morning in a compound where everyone was watching for her to fail. She wasn't thinking about any of that right now. She was thinking about a tug toy being dropped in her lap and the weight of a dog's head against her hand, and the particular sound of an animal who had decided, against everything the last 3 years had given him reason to believe, that trust was still possible. That was worth carrying forward. That was worth building on. That was, at the end of it, the whole point.